Chapter 964, Proof of Competence. Shockingly, nothing disastrous happened while Sunny slept. A gate did not open in the middle of the supply depot, and a stray titan did not break through the blast doors to devour every last person under his protection. Somehow, the world did not collapse. Instead, Sunny woke up to the sounds of peaceful conversation and the smell of cooking food. He remained still for a few minutes, then climbed out of the sleeping niche, checked on his healing wounds, and summoned the puppeteer's shroud to cover his bruised body. In the lounge area of the Rhino, several members of his cohort were eating a hearty breakfast. Surprisingly, Professor Obel was the one cooking, masterfully using rations scavenged from the depot supplies to create something that smelled unexpectedly tasty. Walking closer, Sunny heard Luster speaking with surprising enthusiasm. "Amazing, how did you even make this?" The old man chuckled. Food was much more scarce during my youth than it is now. Ancient relics like me all know how to make a feast out of nothing, young man." Noticing Sunny, Luster pointed to his plate. "Captain, you have to try it." He stuffed his mouth with something that looked like vegetable lasagna, which was rather strange, considering that military rations did not include fresh vegetables, and smiled. "Oh, and we are also flush with water again. Shower is back online." That was a piece of surprisingly good news. The Rhino had a very robust water filtration system, but they had to start rationing it many days ago. The thought of an actual hot shower made Sunny smile. He sat down and curiously tasted Professor Obel's cooking. It was, indeed, rather delicious. Noticing his reaction, the old man chuckled. "Everything potslop. That's what we used to call this Frankenstein of a dish, back in my days. Times may change, but some things always remain the same." Sunny stared at his plate and then frowned. "What's a Frankenstein?" Professor Obel gave him an amused look. "Well, it is a fictional monster, a sort of jigsaw corpse reanimated by a troubled scientist. Actually, perhaps it was the scientist who was the monster." Sunny gave him an understanding nod. I see. A jigsaw corpse. I think I fought one of those before, although it was more of a mountain of bones. I guess you could make bone broth out of that." The professor is really being too harsh on himself. His cooking does not taste like corpse meat at all. I should know. Ignoring the strange glance directed at him, Sunny shrugged and concentrated on his food. The first shift of the irregulars sent into the dream realm was not back yet, so there was nothing pressing for him to do. Sunny finished his meal in peace, then chatted with his men for a bit. One after another, they left to resume their work on preparing the convoy for eventual departure. Bate was probably dealing with the refugees, so she was nowhere to be seen. That left Sunny and Professor Obel alone with each other. The old man studied his face for a few moments, and then suddenly asked, "How are you holding up, Captain Sunless?" Sunny looked at him in confusion. "Me fine, I guess." Professor Obel sighed. "It must be hard, especially for someone so young. In this dire situation, you are responsible for the well-being of hundreds of people, but there is no one caring for your own wellness. So, that was why I asked. How are you, really?" Sunny wanted to retort, but then thought for a while and shrugged. "Actually, it's a bit strange. Everyone here is fighting tooth and nail to survive. Most of them have no control over whether they live or die. Every minute might be their last, and they all know it too. But not me. I am more or less safe. Unless I actively try to do something stupid, I will most likely survive even if the whole convoy is obliterated. My aspect makes it really easy for me to escape most dangers, you know." He hesitated, and then added with some uncertainty, "So, the mental strain that I experience should be far less than that of all these vulnerable people. But for some reason, it does not feel that way. I should not really care how many strangers die around me, but I do. It's like a mental hex, really, me caring. Actually, It's exactly like that, especially because I do find myself doing stupid things to prevent them from dying." Sonny frowned. "Wait, I am not really under a hex that compels me to defend this damned convoy, am I?" Professor Obel suddenly laughed. "A mental hex, that is a very unique way to put it. Isn't it normal for people to care about each other?" Sonny blinked a couple of times. "No, of course not." He shook his head, then added with slight bewilderment, "No one ever cared about me until I became powerful and thus useful. That's just how things work." Sonny had been alone for most of his life. True, after becoming infected by the spell, he had made several good friends, but he had no illusions about the reason for the bond between them. If he had been someone weak and useless, people like Effie, Kai, even Nephi's and Cassie would have never wasted time on becoming close with him. And why should they? Well, there was Rain too, but that was different. She was family, not a random stranger. Professor Obel let out a sad sigh and remained silent for a while. Eventually, he asked, "So why do you think you care about whether the refugees and the mundane soldiers survive? Why are you risking yourself to help them?" Sonny scratched the back of his head. "That I am actually not too sure myself. Maybe it's pride. These people are under my protection, so their deaths would demonstrate my incompetence. Makes sense. It is weird, though. I never really claimed to have something as useless as pride." The old man looked at him with a strange expression, then shook his head. "Do you want to know what I think?" Sonny raised an eyebrow. "Yes." Professor Obel smiled. "I think that you are giving yourself too little credit, young man." Sonny stared at him in confusion. "Huh? What is that supposed to mean?" The old man chuckled. Don't mind me. It's just an old man's rumblings. Maybe you'll understand when you're my age. Until then, please keep caring for these poor people, stupid as it might seem. There's this one truth that I've learned after long decades. You see, humanity would have never survived without a bit of stupidity." News Sonny's people brought from the dream realm was both disturbing and ominous. There was a wealth of updates on the state of affairs in Antarctica, but all of it was overshadowed by one simple fact. Army Command was seemingly unaware that Erebus Field had been wiped off the map. They knew that something had happened, but it was the members of his cohort who brought the first-hand account of the devastation to the dream realm, prompting an intense reaction. That did not bode well for Sonny. Either the siege capital had been destroyed very recently, or the First Army was in much worse shape than he had thought. In any case, the situation meant that the validity of all information received from Army Command had to be taken with a grain of salt from now on. Things were changing too fast for their compromised communication network to keep up. It was just as well. He had already decided to proceed to Falcon Scott, bypassing the less impregnable siege capitals. It was going to be their eventual destination, regardless, that much was clear. It seemed that the situation in East Antarctica was not as dire as the utter disaster of the Antarctic Center, which had much fewer soldiers and less resources allocated to it due to the smaller territory and population, but was being hit by the chain of nightmares much harder, for some reason. As a result, the previous plan was scrapped and hastily replaced with a new one. The incoming naval convoys were going to be redirected to start ferrying the civilian population and the army contingent over the strait to the larger and better protected eastern landmass. Falcon Scott would become the staging ground for the relocation, as well as humanity's last stronghold in the region. The First Army was abandoning the Antarctic Center entirely. So, there was no point in seeking shelter in any other siege capital, even if some of them could still be holding out. All divisions were going to retreat to Falcon Scott eventually, anyway, taking the civilians with them. Sonny sighed. Sounds like a plan. A plan that could very well end in disaster, but a solid one, nevertheless. Army Command was not entirely clueless. Masterjet had to have known about Erebus Field to send her crow after him, after all, so it was not like the entire leadership was compromised. It was just that there were gaps in the flow of information between the headquarters and the people on the front lines, which was detrimental, but inevitable for as long as the winter beast still lived. As much as it pained Sonny to admit it, everyone was doing their best in a terrible situation. There was no one to blame. It was just that he personally had the misfortune of finding himself on the more dreadful end of the terribleness spectrum, as far as circumstances were concerned. Oh, damn it! Shaking his head, he climbed on the roof of the Rhino and silently observed the flurry of activity inside the resupply station. Everyone was busy. Even the refugees were helping load cargo into the vehicles Sergeant Jeer had chosen to commandeer. The crow flew off its perch under the ceiling and landed near him, snuggling close to stare at the humans together. Sonny glanced at the black bird incredulously. "What do you think? Will we make it?" The small monster glanced at him in confusion and cawed a couple of times. Sonny scoffed. "Figures, you're just an echo. Oh, what do I call you anyway?" The bird tilted its head. "CRRO, CRRO." Sonny smiled. "Your name is Crow Crow. Huh, well, I'll just call you Crow if you don't mind." The bird stared at him for a few moments, then cawed and flew away. Shaking his head, Sonny shifted his perception and concentrated on the view of the outside. One of his shadows remained there to watch the approach to the depot, hiding in the darkness. The ash was still falling from the sky, obscuring the stars and the crimson flames of the aurora. Black soot was marring the white surface of the snow, turning it into a dirty gray sludge. The silhouettes of the nearby mountains were outlined by the red glow that emanated from the sea of lava, making the whole landscape seem eerie and infernal. "This entire continent is way too weird. It's like I never left the dream realm." As Sonny thought that, a slight movement attracted his attention. Soon, a flicker of light appeared in the distance, and then a whole river of them showed itself from behind the cold slopes. The stream of light flowed down the mountain road, heading straight for the entrance to the supply depot. His face fell. Ah, not again. Out there in the ashen wilderness, a large column of battered vehicles was rolling down the road, escorted by scores of disheveled soldiers. Some were on foot, some moved with the help of powered exoskeleton armor suits, aiming into the darkness with their high-caliber rifles. The haunted expressions, the lightless eyes, the faces of frightened refugees behind the cracked windows of makeshift transports, all of it was too familiar. Sonny closed his eyes for a moment. Those would be the survivors of Erebus Field, then. With an exasperated sigh, he shook his head, and then jumped off the roof of the Rhino. Outside the underground depot, a long column of vehicles had come to a halt. The soldiers were running to assume defensive positions, and their leaders were barking orders to get them moving faster. In front of the locked blast doors, several people stood with tired expressions on their faces. One of them, an awakened woman in a tattered robe, was cursing as she placed her hand on the security panel over and over again. The mechanical voice was not amused. "Lou, Lieutenant Karen. Verified, insufficient clearance, access denied." "Got him it." The woman slammed her fist into the panel, then glanced at one of the other officers near her. After a few seconds of somber silence, she asked, "Do you think one of you guys can hack it, or are we going to have to blow through this damned gate?" The man hesitated for a while, then opened his mouth to say something. Before he could, however, there was a reverberating hum, and the blast doors suddenly slid to the sides, revealing the entrance of a dark tunnel, and a very pale, very ominous-looking young man in black garments standing there with a strange, eerily calm expression on his face. "I would appreciate it if you don't try to blow up my gate, actually." The awakened woman jumped back with a yelp, and outstretched one hand to summon a weapon. What the hell are you? The pale stranger tilted his head a little and stared at her with his cold, dark eyes. Master Sunless, first irregular company. With that, he looked past the officers at the long column of vehicles behind them. Suddenly, the young man's face grew a little lively. The awakened woman let out a relieved sigh. "Oh, you're human. Wait, master." Glancing back at her, the young man suddenly smiled. "Say, you wouldn't happen to have a few MWP pilots in that convoy of yours, would you?" The new arrivals did indeed turn out to be one of the splinter groups of the Erebus field survivors. There were many more people in their caravan than in Sonny's caravan, but none of the soldiers held a higher military rank than him, the most senior officer among them being an awakened lieutenant named Karen. Needless to say, there were no masters among them either. So, ironically, he ended up being in charge again. Sonny had been responsible for 6 awakened and 2 civilians after leaving Low 49, which suited him fine. Then, more than 300 refugees and several dozens of mundane soldiers joined them. Those numbers seemed like a joke now. After the Erebus field survivors joined his group, Sonny found himself in command of a significantly larger force. There were more than 4,000 civilians currently sheltered in the crowded resupply station, as well as 500 mundane soldiers. Lieutenant Karen had many awakened warriors with her, as well as 4 new sleepers. Sonny sent the latter to their nameless counterpart, placing the young man in charge. The guy had turned out to be quite resourceful, and Bell's mentorship seemed to be bearing fruit. Not to mention that his core was close to being saturated already. In the end, there were now 3 full awakened cohorts, and a half, under Sonny's command. There were also 12 powerful MWPs being piloted by mundane specialists, and more than enough powered armor suits for the soldiers, which drastically increased the caravan's defensive ability. The vast supply reserves of the underground station suddenly did not look so inexhaustible anymore. This is going to be a headache. Studying the crowded depot, Sonny grimaced. The increase in power and in the number of tools at his disposal was welcome, but he would have to rethink his entire strategy as to how to traverse the 2,000 kilometers separating them from Falcon Scott. Before, Sonny had mostly put his efforts into avoiding combat engagements, meticulously circumventing nightmare creatures and only attacking those swarms that could not be bypassed. But with a caravan this large, that was not an option anymore. There was just no way to perfectly hide so many people. Luckily, the caliber of threats they could take on also increased. With several cohorts of awakened and a small army under his command, Sonny would be able to simply roll over many swarms, maybe even cut a path through the weaker hordes of abominations. But all of that required a lot of mental adjustment and even more work for his shadows. His map would also have to be updated to account for the changes in the caravan's composition. Oh well, no sleep for me today it seems. Walking toward the rhino with a slightly exasperated expression, Sonny couldn't help but hear bits and pieces of the conversations the new arrivals were having with the members of the initial convoy. "I don't think any of us can survive." "What's that? Cheer up, man. The devil himself is with us, so who can be against us?" "Oh, so it's that Master Sunless. No wonder the name sounded familiar. I heard about him, even though he was assigned to a different division. Still, what can one man do?" "Damn, what can he do? I swear to the dead gods, I saw him kill 100 nightmare creatures with a single arrow once. There was also this one time when he summoned a whole damn bridge out of thin air for us to cross a canyon. Hell, the man fought a titan to a stalemate just yesterday, actually. I am not even sure that it was a stalemate. All I know is that the captain came back, but the titan did not." A corner of Sonny's mouth twisted up a little. His people were surely fond of embellishing his deeds, but he was not going to intervene. At this point, Anything that raised morale of the troops was a good thing, even if it was not entirely based in truth. He climbed into the Rhino and walked to the command suite, studying the new faces among the usual participants of strategic meetings. Sonny already knew awakened Karen, but the two mundane officers she brought for debriefing were strangers. Let's start. What he wanted to know first was how Erebus Field had fallen. The truth turned out to be as disturbing as Sonny had thought. As he had suspected, the city had been destroyed very recently. In fact, it had just happened 2 days ago, around the time he and his people were deciding to try their luck by charging the coastal highway. The main culprit of the disaster was also familiar. It was none other than his good friend Goliath. Damned bastard! After missing for the better half of 2 months, the stone giant had suddenly emerged from within Mount Erebus, breaking through one of its slopes and causing a whole side of the volcano to collapse. The resulting conflagration and the flood of lava had little chance of destroying a city that had been well fortified against exactly such an event, even if on a smaller scale. However, that was before the towering colossus smashed through the city defenses, destroying the grandiose magma barriers, drain vents, and most other contingencies the government had put in place. With the perimeter of the siege capital breached, a titan rampaging on its periphery, rivers of lava flowing through the broken barriers, and hordes of nightmare creatures using the chance to get inside, there had been nothing that the 1st Army Division stationed at Erebus Field could do to stop the cataclysmic assault. The few masters of the accompanying awakened force had joined forces to stall Goliath for as long as they could, while the soldiers desperately tried to evacuate the civilians. That was probably where Davis and his cohort of irregulars had perished. Lieutenant Karen did not know how many people had made it out of that hell in the end, but judging by her expression, it was probably much less than the total population of the city. The last thing she had witnessed before leading the caravan away was the colossal figure of Goliath, turned incandescent from bathing in the molten lava, plunging into the ocean and disappearing under the dark waves. From where the Titan had emerged the next day to attack Sonny's convoy. After Karen was finished speaking, a somber silence settled inside the Rhino. No one knew what exactly to say. Eventually, Sonny sighed. Their nightmare is over. 2 days later, they abandoned the resupply station. The underground depot was left almost empty, since Sonny had decided to take everything they could on the road. Not all the vehicles were loaded to capacity, but even if there was just a driver and a shooter inside, every last one was commandeered and put to good use. Only the discarded civilian transports, and those of the Erebus Field vehicles that were too damaged to remain reliable, were left behind. Nightmare, Abomination, and Blackie moved at the front of the caravan, serving as its vanguard. The Rhino was still at the head, but it was now flanked by 2 lumbering MWPs, both of them constantly scanning the surroundings with their high-tech optical arrays. Behind them, the long column of vehicles stretched for more than a kilometer on the mountain road. The remaining 10 MWPs and 24 awakened were spread along its length, meant to protect the caravan in case of an attack from the flanks. Most of the vehicles were armed, and there were personnel carriers with full companies of mechanized infantry placed strategically among the refugee transports. All in all, the caravan looked like a big, delicious target for nightmare creatures, but also one that would be extremely hard to swallow. I'd like to see the bastards try. Actually, scratch that. I'd rather not. Sonny was positioned on the roof of the Rhino, wearing his military coat over the mantle of the underworld. With the elemental resistance of the onyx armor and the memory of ice slotted into it, he was more or less immune to mundane cold, so the chilling nature of the polar night was not bothering him too much. The falling ash, though, was still irritating. Hopefully, they would leave the area near Mount Erebus soon. The wind was blowing in the other direction, which not only moved the clouds of ash away from the caravan, but would also make it harder for those nightmare creatures that relied on their sense of smell to detect the approaching humans far in advance. Still, he had no illusions that theirs would be a smooth ride. Luckily, Sonny was extremely well suited to serve as a guide. He had updated his map with as many details as he could and planned multiple suitable routes for the caravan. With his shadows scouting ahead and the crow keeping an eye out for hidden threats from high above, he was as informed about the surrounding area and the enemy movements as anyone could be. The shadows scouted most enemies long before the long column of vehicles approached, and the black bird with its magical eyes was able to notice anything that they missed. The combination was extremely effective. Information was the lifeblood of warfare, so Sonny had a considerable advantage. He was going to use it well to navigate the treacherous expanse of the Antarctic Center and reach Falcon Scott unscathed. His task had grown much harder because of the sheer size of the caravan, but on the other hand, the land they were traversing was also different from the complicated network of decrepit old roads in the south. The infrastructure between Erebus Field and the northern parts of the landmass had indeed been much more developed, and then expanded on by the First Army in the recent months to boot. Plus, they were moving away from the area that had been affected by the earthquake the most, so there were fewer signs of destruction and obstacles on their path the further north the caravan drove. The roads were wider and better preserved, the terrain was less rugged. It was not as flat and straight as the coastal highway, of course, but Sonny felt reluctant to return to the ocean just yet. Even if he did, it would only be to bypass an especially difficult region and then swiftly return to the mountains. Or not at all. At first, there were not too many nightmare creatures in the way. Most of them that had been in the immediate area probably migrated to the ruins of Erebus Field and were yet to return. What little resistance the caravan did meet was promptly obliterated by the irregulars and Karens awakened. For the first day or so, the MWPs did not even have to fire a single shot. The next one brought more enemies with it, however. The caravan did not stop, with drivers working in shifts to keep it moving, so the destroyed city was now far behind them. Here, the abominations ran free, and plenty of them caught the scent of the large group of refugees. Swarm after swarm assaulted the column of vehicles, shattering against its defenses. The devastating barrage of bullets tore them apart, accompanied by arrows and magical projectiles tossed by the awakened. The MWPs let their monstrous Gatling guns and heavy mass drivers cut large swaths through the mass of abominations, sending swarms of explosive missiles flying from the mounted launchers from time to time. If the nightmare creatures got too close, destructive flamethrowers and awakened fighters made short work of them. If there were fallen or corrupted abominations among the swarms, Sonny and Nightmare charged forward before the creatures could do any harm to the refugees. With Sergeant Gier running logistics and organizing the mundane soldiers, Lieutenant Karen commanding most of the awakened, and Bate caring for the needs of the civilians, that was pretty much all he had to do. Dealing with the various powers nightmare creatures possessed was a bit challenging, but mostly, Sonny found himself unexpectedly free, which was good, since he had plenty of time to address his tasks as the strategist and guide of the caravan, but still. Weird, am I actually a little bored? Looking at the remains of another swarm that the column had all but rolled over, Sonny scratched the back of his head. He knew, of course, that this rate of progress would not continue indefinitely. In fact, they were bound to get bloodied as soon as he failed to lead the caravan past a real horde of nightmare creatures, which was getting harder and harder to do. That had not happened yet, though. Am I suddenly very lucky, or has my luck just been really terrible up until now? Sonny pondered about it for a few moments and decided that it was probably both. The question was, how long would the stretch of good fortune last? A few more days passed in the clamor of firing armaments and frenzied howls of dying nightmare creatures. The dark landscape of the Antarctic center flowed past the incessantly moving caravan, with the starlight and the undulating visage of Aurora Australis finally appearing from behind the clouds of ash, only to be devoured by the veil of snow. The blizzard was picking up again, making Sonny wonder if he was going to meet the second Titan raging in the region. He was not very enthused to make its acquaintance, to say the least. The journey was a strange one. Sonny was used to things going south fast, but the situation of the caravan was very different. Instead of something dreadful and devastating happening all at once, their circumstances were growing slightly more dire with every hour, bringing them closer to annihilation little by little. The confident pace the caravan had established after leaving the resupply station was long gone. Instead of rare skirmishes with weak swarms of nightmare creatures, they were now embroiled in a nearly unstoppable battle, with the sea abominations flooding the northern reaches of the Antarctic center. The pressure on the awakened and the MWP pilots had increased tremendously, and the infantrymen had to bloody their bayonets on more than one occasion already. Worst of all was the inescapable corrosion that the multitude of gates were exerting on their tech. The military vehicles were shielded from the detrimental effects of the call to some degree, but very few had the same rare and expensive modifications as the Rhino had. They were managing for now, but there was no telling how long it would last. The problems were mounting. The casualties were mounting too. During the harrowing push to Erebus Field, Sonny had lost only a handful of people to the vagaries of the spell and the deadly crucible of battle. Their losses were few enough to consider each one a poignant event. It was not so much for the current step of the journey. The caravan had grown too much, and the combat engagements they had to fight were too frequent and intensive to avoid losing soldiers. The attrition rate was not terrible, and in fact remained admirably low, but it seemed that every time Gier contacted him to give an update on the state of the column, more names had to be added to the list. Sonny was strangely bothered by it. He had thought that with the drastic increase in numbers, the loss of individual soldiers would not affect him too much, especially if the casualties were below expected. He had also thought that he would eventually grow numb to the news of people under his command dying. But he had not. The more of his soldiers died, no matter how few, the more bitter and angry he felt. However, the most powerful emotion he experienced was rather unexpected. Indignation. Sonny felt indignant about the fact that he was forced to watch good men and women die, to see mundane humans putting their lives on the line to protect the defenseless refugees. All the while the truly powerful ones were nowhere to be seen, embroiled into their own internal strife. Damned bastards. Maybe he wasn't cut out to be a leader, after all. That was not to say that Sonny was ineffective. On the contrary, he was doing a good job of leading the caravan and pretending to be an intrepid commander. However, it was all alien to him. It was something he was doing because the circumstances had forced him to, not because he wished to play that role. Living alone in the dark had been much more comfortable. Ah, good old times. There was another strange thing about the caravan's advance north, something that Sonny should have expected, but nevertheless failed to account for. Despite the slow attrition, the number of people under his command was not reducing. Instead, it was growing, ballooning even. The further they drove, the larger the caravan became. There were other large groups of people who had escaped from Erebus Field, squads of soldiers that had lost contact with Army command due to the blizzard, and evacuation convoys that had gotten stuck in a limbo after their destination was destroyed. All of them were happy to see a well-organized force moving north, especially since it was led by a master. So they joined the caravan. Sonny could not really turn the stragglers away, and at that point there was no point to. So the 4,000 refugees under his protection turned to 5, then 6, and then 12. The 500 soldiers turned into more than 1,000. The 3 cohorts of awakened swelled to 7, and there were now 2 auxiliary sleeper cohorts instead of 1. There were many more vehicles, too. The bloated caravan stretched for 2 kilometers now and showed no signs of stopping the rapid expansion. Looking at it, Sonny couldn't help but shake his head. That's just a recipe for disaster. At this rate, he was going to end up leading a whole division by the time they reached Falcon Scott, if they reached it. Hopefully, he would stumble on a colonel or 2 and push the command responsibility on them soon. If the colonel was not an idiot, of course. Sonny had just finished dealing with a very nasty fallen demon laying in ambush in the path of the caravan and returned to the head of the column. As soon as he appeared from the shadows on the roof of the rhino, the crow flew down and perched on his shoulder, his feathers ruffled and covered with snowflakes. He glanced at the miserable bird and sighed. "What, did you see something?" The small monster bobbed its head. "CRRO saw." Sonny waited for the crow to continue, knowing that it had to be bad for the echo to seek him out. The flying monster cawed again. "Horde." With that, the bird turned its head and pointed its beak in a certain direction. "Curse it." There was a horde of nightmare creatures ahead, one that the crow did not know how to avoid. Finally, Sonny's fears had come true. He hurriedly sent the shadow that was closest to the direction where the echo was pointing to forward. It had already been scouting far ahead, but apparently not far enough. Soon Sonny's eyes narrowed. There was indeed a vast horde of abominations, and bypassing it was out of the question. Well, unless he used the coastal highway, of course. In that case, the caravan would have a chance of skirting the sea of abominations unmolested, a slim chance at that. They would also be risking a meeting with something even worse. Damnation! Sonny's shadow swiftly glided through the darkness, climbing the steep slopes above the vast river of nightmare creatures. Sonny was trying to gauge the true size of the horde, but no matter how hard he looked, there was simply no end to it. All kinds of abominations were gathered in a tremendous mob which spilled over the cliffs, undulating and crawling over the landscape. The horde was stretched into a long line, moving from east to west toward the coast. The width of it was somewhat bearable, making the thought of trying to cut through the mass of nightmare creatures appear tentatively in his mind. However, the length of the horde was simply too oppressive. The caravan was very large now, and even if Sonny managed to create a breach in the river of monsters, not all vehicles would be able to pass through before a tide of abominations ripped them apart. It was still an option, though. He had to think strategically. To the east, the horde stretched for as far as his shadow could see. To the west, there was still some space between the front ranks of the mob of nightmare creatures and the coastal highway. If the column of vehicles sped up while the abominations maintained their pace, there was a good chance that they would narrowly miss each other. If not, the caravan would be caught between the horde and the ocean, potentially suffering even more casualties. That was not even considering that something could attack them from the water as well. Sonny sighed. Crap. The first option all but guaranteed that people would die, but had a lower damage ceiling. The second promised a small chance that no one would be killed at all, but had the potential to turn really disastrous if things went wrong. He hesitated for a few moments, then contacted Gier. Yes, Captain. Sonny gritted his teeth. There's a horde of nightmare creatures ahead. Full forward, and we will be taking a detour via the highway. Inform everyone to prepare for a tough battle. There, the decision had been made. Sonny was not happy with it, but at least the caravan stood a chance of escaping unscathed. He was not ready to callously send people to die yet, even if it meant risking a more dire result. At the end of it, Sonny would know that he at least tried. Following his orders, Luster sent the rhino flying forward. Their MWP escorts strained to keep up, but eventually adjusted to the increased pace. The military vehicles comprising the caravan followed suit, and soon, the whole column was moving forward at a reckless speed. "Do not brake." Sonny stared back, hoping that nothing would go wrong. If a vehicle broke down in the middle of the charge, there would be no saving its passengers. A faulty transport could also potentially slow down everyone behind it, which would be a complete disaster. However, the fewer number of gates along the coast was one of the reasons he had chosen the second option. So if anything, leaving the mountains for a bit should only lessen the probability of a serious malfunction. The Rhino maneuvered to a branching road and led the caravan west, descending toward the highway. As they approached it, Sonny tensely observed the horde and tried to calculate if they were going to make it past the advancing mob of abominations before it reached the coast. For now, it seemed that there was still a narrow window of opportunity. But then, as soon as they reached the highway, that window was gone. For some reason, the front ranks of the horde suddenly went into a frenzy and rushed forward, with the rest of the mob soon following in an avalanche of flesh. Sonny was sure that the nightmare creatures could not have sensed the caravan yet, so he did not know why their behavior changed so abruptly. It was as though something on the coast was pulling the abominations toward it. In any case, with the horde moving much faster now, any chance of passing by without a battle the column might have had were gone. They would have to fight their way through in the end. Curses! At least the caravan was only going to be assaulted from one side. Their left flank would be protected by the ocean, precarious as it might sound. What the hell spooked these bastards? Looking forward to see the first abomination spilling onto the highway some distance away, Sonny froze for a moment. Out there ahead of them, laying on the shore like a mountain of white flesh, the corpse of a colossal abomination towered above the highway. It looked like a monstrous jellyfish of mind-boggling proportions, some of its lifeless tentacles stretching for hundreds of meters into the dark water. The strange, transparent flesh of the dead dweller of the depths was torn and scorched, with large chunks of it missing. Strange organs could be seen beneath it, and a lake of freezing slime covered a long stretch of the highway around it. Something had thoroughly savaged the terrifying creature, and then left without devouring its prey. And now, the horde of nightmare creatures was rushing to finish the job. As Sonny watched, the tide of abominations flowed over the highway. The first ranks sunk their fangs into the dead horror with rabid hunger, followed by 100 other creatures the next second. The appalling corpse was giant, but not giant enough to satiate them all. Soon, the slower nightmare creatures reached the coast, ruthlessly tearing at the bodies of their feasting brethren to reach the succulent white flesh. They crawled over the towering jellyfish like ants, slowly eviscerating its upper layers. And behind them, countless more were already flowing down the mountain slopes. Sonny gripped his bow, knowing the caravan would have to fight their way through that dreadful barrier of monstrous bodies soon. Actually, a few stragglers were already close enough for Samara to start firing her rifle. Looking at the approaching scene of morbid carnage, Sonny felt a chill run down his spine. It's all right, we can still pull through this. That was what he thought. At least until eerie flashes of crimson light ignited in the haze of the blizzard to his left, far in the ocean. An enormous, gargantuan shape was moving through the waves, getting closer to the shore. As the caravan approached the spilling horde of nightmare creatures, Sonny readied himself for battle and feverishly tried to come up with a way, any way, to save the lives of as many people as he could. However, no matter how much he thought about it, there was just no solution. Many souls were going to be lost today, and the best he could accomplish was to make sure that those who were dying were the soldiers, and not the refugees. He knew that the caravan would be able to break through the horde of abominations eventually, but he also knew that at least several vehicles, as well as scores of his soldiers, would perish in the process. Hundreds, if not thousands of humans were going to die today. His gamble did not pay off. Sonny felt a bit resentful about that. With a sigh, he summoned the helmet of the mantle of the underworld and raised Morgan's warbow. It was at that moment that eerie crimson lights flashed through the haze of the blizzard, followed by a scattering of small sparks. He froze and looked to his left, at the dark expanse of the ocean that was obscured by the veil of snow. Out there, something inconceivably gargantuan was hiding, its enormous shape only revealed by the hazy flashes of crimson light. What? In the next moment, a deafening roar assaulted his ears, and then something that he had never expected happened. Ahead of the convoy, the mass of nightmare creatures were suddenly torn apart by a series of earth-shattering explosions. Bits of concrete, flesh, and bone flew into the air, creating a cloud of red fog. A moment later, flowers of angry red flame bloomed on the slope of the mountain, obliterating even more abominations. The whole world trembled. Sonny's eyes widened as he swiftly looked back at the ocean. The wall of the blizzard had been unmade, as well, and although the breach in the snowstorm was already closing, he still managed to catch a glimpse of the source of all that carnage. The gargantuan shape drifting on the waves was a massive, battered battleship. He thought he even recognized the lines of its mangled alloy hull. The vessel was strangely slanted, one of its sides resting much lower than the other one, the deck railings almost touching the water. Its hull was marred by terrible scars and breached in many places, with some of the holes being large enough for the rhino to drive through, and was just what remained above the surface. The bow of the ship seemed shattered and deformed. It was a mystery how the vessel remained afloat. And yet, it was still capable of firing its armaments. The crimson lights Sonny had seen were the batteries of starboard cannons unleashing hell, and the scattering of sparks was the salvo of missiles being launched from their nests. As Sonny watched, the ghostly battleship fired another barrage of heavy explosive rounds at the horde of nightmare creatures, this time aiming entirely at the slopes of the mountains. He blinked. I'll be damned. Did they really receive reinforcements? Sonny did not know where the wrecked vessel had come from, but he was not going to waste this opportunity. The intention of the unknown captain was clear. The first salvo somewhat cleared the highway, and the second one overshot it by a good degree, slamming into the mountain slope and obliterating a large swath of advancing nightmare creatures, cutting off those who still remained on the road from the rest of the horde, for now, while simultaneously opening a path for the caravan. That was his chance. Silently thanking the daredevil who had used the sinking ship to come to their rescue, Sonny drew his bow and sent the strike of thunder flying forward. A moment later, it hit the mountain of white flesh, electrocuting scores of abominations that had been fighting to devour the giant jellyfish just a few moments before. All forward units attack. The MWPs running beside the rhino simultaneously raised their bulky hands and opened fire. Their accuracy while on the move was not too great, but that was not important when massive Gatling guns were involved. Streams of heavy rounds whipped across the surviving nightmare creatures, ripping many to shreds. A moment later, two swarms of missiles shot from the shoulders of the lumbering machines, adding to the chaos. From somewhere further behind, heavy-duty mass drivers joined the fray, with the turrets of the assault vehicles soon following. The front of the caravan had once again formed into a wedge to open lines of fire for more attackers. Only this time, there were many more vehicles, awakened and war platforms shooting. The already thinned front rows of the mass of nightmare creatures covering the highway were all but erased from existence by their onslaught. A moment later, the rhino plowed into the remaining stragglers, painting itself with red. Sonny sent several arrows flying, and then dismissed his bow, summoning the cruel sight instead. As soon as he saw the APC clear the stretch of the road obstructed by the horde, he stepped through the shadows and appeared in the thick of the enemies descending from the mountains. Even though most of them were being destroyed by the continuous barrage from the mangled battleship, many were still getting through. The cacophony of bestial howls, thunderous explosions, and roaring artillery strikes was shaking the world, but he did not let it distract him. Now that the head of the caravan had broken through the blockade, the battle was not over. On the contrary, it was just starting. They had to hold back the tide of monsters to let the whole column drive through the created corridor, and then stall the abominations to let it escape. Moving with practiced grace, he butchered a lunging monstrosity that resembled a wingless bat, and then crushed another creature's skull with the butt of his spear. The dying wish weaved itself into existence, summoning the ire of the frenzied horde upon him, but also inspiring his soldiers. One after another, the cohorts of the awakened joined Sonny in building a wall of sharp steel along the edge of the highway. The MWPs stood behind them, drowning the mountain slopes with hellfire unleashed by their flamethrowers. Several personnel carriers stopped, releasing companies of mechanized infantry, each soldier clad in an exoskeleton suit of powered armor and carrying a heavy rifle. In a matter of minutes, the safe corridor was secured. Now, all they had to do was hold the line and show the abominations what the First Army was really made of. Devil is with us. Show them hell. Burn and fire, you wretches. Sonny was rather surprised by the enthusiasm the soldiers who had just recently joined his caravan were showing. Well, he was not going to complain. Maybe it was the effect of the dying wish, or maybe they just wanted to avenge Erebus Field and wash off the shame of defeat off their souls. Thrusting the cruel sight into the open maw of a fallen abomination, he suddenly felt a strange jolt run through the mantle of the underworld. Suddenly, the onyx armor felt slightly lighter. What is that about? Shaking off the weird feeling, he jerked the corpse of the nightmare creature off his spear's blade and looked around, searching for another target. Sonny and his soldiers held back the abominations, while the long column of vehicles drove through the cleared corridor. The pressure the horde was exerting on them was dire, but not impossible to overcome thanks to the artillery support from the mangled battleship. The awakened and the mundane soldiers worked together, aided by the lumbering MWPs and assault vehicles. Soon, the whole mountain slope was torn apart and enveloped in flames. An angry red glow spread through the blizzard, making it seem as though the snow itself was aflame, and the sounds of firing armaments, detonating explosives, and bestial howls fused into an ugly, deafening litany. Sonny was busy dealing with the most threatening abominations, moving through the shadows to reach them in time. His swift figure appeared from and disappeared into the darkness, leaving a trail of death and devastation behind. Sometimes, it almost seemed as though he was existing in several places simultaneously, which fueled the zeal of his soldiers. For now, the line of defenders was holding, and every minute they did, more vehicles drove past the monstrous corpse of the giant jellyfish to clear the battlefield. So far, so good. At some point, the cannons of the battleship grew quiet, and the rain of artillery shells stopped. Either the vessel had run out of ammunition, or the stress of sustaining the heavy barrage had turned out to be too much for its already failing hull, causing it to sustain even more damage. In any case, by that point, most of the caravan had managed to pass the advancing horde. With artillery bombardment gone and no killing field between them and the highway anymore, a flood of nightmare creatures rushed forward, aiming to slam into the defensive line of humans and rip them apart. That was when Sonny finally utilized shadow manifestation. He had not used it before in order to conserve essence for this exact moment, but now there was no point in holding back anything anymore. Rows of dark spikes rose from the ground, obstructing the advance of the abominations and forcing some to impale themselves on their sharp tips. Pushed from behind by the frenzied mob, more were run through, perishing right there and then. Others were simply slowed down. The spikes were soon destroyed, but their job was already done. The momentum of the horde was stalled, and the MWPs were able to create a wall of fire in its way. A few moments later, burning monsters burst through the flames, lunging at the defensive line with rabid rage. They were met by sharp steel and a rain of bullets. "Hold, we are not done yet." Following his command, the soldiers held. The awakened were burning through their essence, while the mundane fighters were exhausting their ammunition, but they held. 1 minute, then 2. Finally, the last of the vehicles drove past and disappeared into the haze of the snowstorm. Sonny let out a relieved sigh. The battle was not over yet, but at least the refugees were safe. Infantry retreat. Pulling out of the furious engagement was not an easy task and had to be done in stages. First, the mundane soldiers orderly retreated, loading into the personnel carriers. After the massive vehicles drove off, the weakened defensive line shifted, slowly moving back. As they did, the MWPs fired clusters of remote-controlled landmines, leaving hundreds of them in the wake of the retreating human force. Once enough of the pushing nightmare creatures entered the blast zone, the mines detonated, momentarily shaking the world. The defenders used that moment to abandon the battle. The awakened jumped onto the roofs of waiting vehicles, which then sped away. The MWPs followed, turning their torsos 180 degrees to continue firing back as they ran. Sonny was left alone to face the wrath of the bloodied horde. Well, not quite. Nightmare emerged from the shadows with fury and bloodlust burning in his crimson eyes. Looking at the approaching tide of abominations, Sonny smiled coldly. "Come at us, bastards." The shadows surged around him, shooting forward like dark chains. At the same time, the cruel sight shined with incandescent light. He used the chains and walls of shadows to funnel the nightmare creatures, killing and maiming as many as he could with his spear. Nightmare rampaged in their midst, too swift to be caught and brought down, at least for now. But then again, they were not going to linger for long. All Sonny had to do was buy his soldiers time to put some distance between themselves and the enemy. Soon, all his defenses were obliterated, and it seemed like he and his shadow were going to be overwhelmed in mere moments. That was when both of them turned into incorporeal shadows and fled, leaving a sea of furious nightmare creatures behind. Now the battle was truly finished. What was especially great about its conclusion, and a pleasant surprise to Sonny, was that while some abominations lunged in pursuit of the caravan, most remained, seemingly more interested in the carcass of the monstrous jellyfish and the corpses of their own slain brethren. It seemed that the caravan had managed to escape. Thank the gods. A minute later, Sonny and Nightmare emerged from the shadows and flew over the highway, soon catching up to the retreating soldiers. The caravan was still out of sight, hidden behind the wall of snow, but they would rejoin the main column soon. In cases like these, the forward force was meant to slow down, so as not to leave itself without sufficient protection for too long. Sonny ordered his steed to get close to the rearmost vehicle and looked at Samara, who was unsurprisingly sitting on its roof. With her red hair dancing in the wind, she was aiming her rifle back, firing a shot into the blizzard from time to time. "How are you on essence?" Samara glanced at him briefly, then smiled. "Doing well, Captain." With a nod, he jumped up, placing his feet on the saddle, then leaped over to the roof of the vehicle and settled next to his sharpshooter. Sonny was confident in his riding skill, but not confident enough to try sitting on Nightmare backwards and shooting his bow. As Morgan's warbow started weaving itself from scarlet sparks, Sonny lingered for a moment, and then summoned the runes. That strange jolt I felt at the start of the battle. Don't tell me, did I finally fulfill the requirements of the mantle of the underworld? Sonny zoned out for a little, not paying attention to Samara, and the MWPs discharging their weapons from time to pick off the most stubborn of the pursuers. The rate of their fire was slowing down, anyway, meaning that the bulk of abominations had either fallen behind or were already killed. The Prince of the Underworld enchantment and its dreadful counter of vanquished foes, gods, he had been stuck with that thing for so long. Despite the fact that Sonny had inherited the onyx armor with some of it already filled, it still took him years to accumulate 6,000 victories. Come to think of it, the whole mongrel debacle had happened because of his desire to increase the number on the counter somewhat. I can't believe I've finally done it. Curious to see what changed, Sonny looked at the runes. He was a bit tense, after all. The description of the Prince of the Underworld only said that the armor would be growing stronger the more foes he vanquished, and it had over the years. The cost of keeping its active enchantments running had diminished slightly, and their effects had become a little more pronounced. The description said nothing about the mantle receiving an upgrade after the counter was filled. That was just his assumption. Come on. Concentrating on the name of the memory, he read. Memory, Mantle of the Underworld. Memory rank ascended. Memory tier, VII. No. The mantle seemed to have grown from a Tier 6 memory to a Tier 7 one. That was not bad, but it did leave Sonny a little disappointed. He had hoped that it would increase in rank instead. He sighed, then continued to study the runes, turning his attention to the enchantments. The Living Stone, Feather of Truth, Stalwart, and Underworld Armament enchantments remained exactly the same. None of them received any enhancements. The Prince of the Underworld had not changed either, except for the fact that the counter now showed a pleasant 6,000/6,000 as the number of vanquished foes. There was a new enchantment at the end of the list, though. Soulbound Relic. Sonny blinked a couple of times. Suddenly excited, he concentrated on the enchantment to read its description. The description, however, left him largely confused. It did not provide any information about what a soulbound relic was or what powers that title entailed. Instead, the shimmering runes simply stated, "Bind the relic." He was probably supposed to answer yes or no. However, Sonny lingered. He had no idea what binding the mantle of the underworld to his soul meant, and how it would change the onyx armor, or his soul, for that matter. Of course, the effect was most likely meant to be beneficial, since it was a reward for achieving an amazing feat. The spell often had a very strange notion of what beneficial meant, though, which did not always coincide with what a human would consider such. Take his own aspect. For example, its innate ability, Shadow Bond, had become the bane of his existence, and yet the spell clearly thought of it as a precious boon. Further still, the mantle of the underworld was not even the spell's creation. Rather, it was a memory of an artifact created by Nether, the demon of destiny, most likely for one of his stone children. Sonny suspected that it had once belonged to the stranger, one of the 7 heroes of the Forgotten Shore, who had been of Saint's tribe and possibly her previous lord. So, what would actually happen if he bound that artifact to his soul? He hesitated for a while, then dismissed the runes. Not because he had decided against activating the new enchantment, but rather because his shadows had noticed something strange on the road ahead, the tail of the caravan. The caravan, for whatever reason, had stopped. Damn it! That was outside the scope of the action plan he had established. Luster was not supposed to stop the rhino unless something truly drastic happened. Sonny prepared himself for the worst, but then relaxed a little after discovering the reason for the unexpected turn of events. It was honestly hard to miss. Slightly ahead of the convoy, beached on the cold shore, the mangled battleship that had helped them break through the horde of nightmare creatures towered like a vast mountain of metal. Up close, The damage done to it looked even more dreadful. Its hull was full of holes, and most of its cargo holds seemed to be full of water. It was obvious that the proud vessel would never sail again. People were emerging from the breaches in the hull, looking like tiny ants as they loaded into lifeboats and headed for the shore. Some of them had already reached land and were now talking to a small crowd of soldiers from the caravan. Sonny let out a relieved sigh, told Samara to establish a perimeter around the rear of the column, and jumped off the vehicle, turning into a shadow. Gliding to the front of the caravan did not take him long. Returning to his human form near the rhino, Sonny dismissed the helmet of the mantle and headed toward the welcoming party. I should really thank whoever was in charge of that battleship. They saved our skin back there. As he neared the small crowd, he heard a pleasant but strained voice asking a question. "Your commanding officer, then?" One of the soldiers responded. "Oh, that would be the devil, I mean captain." The representative of the ship interrupted him, sounding surprised and a little tense. "Your commanding officer is a devil." The soldier grunted. "Not a devil, the devil. But don't worry, sir, it's just a nickname, I think." At that moment, Sonny finally reached them and saw the speaker. His eyes widened a little. Tall, handsome, with black hair, and eyes of an unusual, beautiful indigo color. No wonder the voice sounded familiar. Neve. The Nightwalker seemed a bit ragged and worse for wear, but it was unmistakably Master Neve of the House of Night, his temporary pal. Hearing Sonny's voice, Neve looked away from the soldier he had been talking with, then lowered his gaze a little and smiled in surprise. "Sunless, wait, is it really you? How are you here?" Sonny coughed awkwardly, then glanced at the talkative soldier with murder in his eyes. "Ah, that's me, actually. I'm the devil in charge of delivering these fools from hell." Neve stared at him in bewilderment for a few moments, then glanced at the column of military vehicles that stretched far into the distance. "You are the commanding officer. Things must have changed, then, not that I'm complaining. It's actually great to see a familiar face. I just thought that you were supposed to be in charge of a single cohort of elite awakened." Sonny sighed. "Yeah, well, the situation is a mess, so I ended up being in charge of an entire battalion instead, as well as around 12,000 refugees. Anyway, thanks for the rescue. I really owe you one, Neve. That battle could have turned ugly without your ship's support." He studied the gargantuan shape of the beached vessel, finally recognizing it as the battleship that had delivered his cohort to Antarctica several months ago. Or what was left of it, rather. Neve let out an amused chuckle. "Ah, yes, the rescue, truth be told, it is us who need to be rescued. As you can see, the ship is not exactly in great shape, and the crew, the ones who are still alive, are not in any way prepared for a long landbound march across Antarctica. We are only truly capable at sea, and even then." He glanced at the mangled remains of the fearsome vessel. "Ah, the sea turned out to be more capable than us in the end. In any case, your caravan is pretty much our best hope. So, do you maybe have space in these vehicles for a few thousand shipwrecked sailors? Give or take?" Sonny stared at him for a few moments, then smiled. "Sure, no problem. That can be arranged. There's a lot of useful stuff left in those cargo holds, I assume. Come with me, and we can discuss the details. How the hell did your ship end up here anyway? Wasn't the convoy supposed to be coursing between Falcon Scott and the Northern Quadrant?" As it turned out, Neve's vessel was one of those that, like Ariadne, had been reassigned to patrol and relocation duty after the situation in the Antarctic Center worsened with the appearance of hostile Titans. His last orders were to scout and secure the stretch of the coastal highway between Erebus Field and the northern parts of the landmass, probably for the upcoming exodus of the First Army to Falcon Scott. Sadly, Erebus Field had been destroyed, and the battleship met an adversary that was a little bit too tough for it. In the end, they had managed to kill the monstrous jellyfish, whose corpse eventually washed up on the shore, but not before sustaining catastrophic damage. With no friendly port nearby, the vessel drifted along the coast for a while before encountering Sunny's caravan. Sunny spared Neve a grim look. I was actually supposed to be evacuated from the southernmost tip of the region by a vessel called Ariadne. It was destroyed, too, leaving me stranded there. What was Army Command thinking, separating individual battleships from the convoy? Wasn't it obvious that it would be too dangerous for them to sail alone? The tall Nightwalker sighed somberly. Not as obvious as you might think. The coastal waters are not usually that dangerous when compared to the true deep sea, or at least they used to be safer. There were risks involved, of course, but that is a given when you are desperate. Still, we might have underestimated how much influence the chain of nightmares would exert on the ocean. Makes sense, I guess. Sunny was not surprised that Army Command had chosen to send the division spread across the Antarctic Center some naval support. Logistically, it was a risky, but somewhat necessary decision, considering that the Winter Beast had shut down the entire communication network across the landmass. And it was not like Neve's battleship had been immediately sunk. The fearsome vessel operated along the coast for close to 2 months before stumbling on the abominable jellyfish and suffering a Pyrrhic victory that led to its demise. If anything, Sunny was more surprised that the House of Night had agreed to play ball. Since when were the great clans so altruistic? That's a conversation for later. For now, both Neve and Sunny had a lot to do. The structure of the caravan had to be reorganized to make room for the surviving sailors. The sailors themselves had to disembark and reach land. The maimed battleship had to be scoured for anything that could be useful for the long journey to Falcon Scott. All of that required time, which meant that the column would remain static for a while. A proper defensive perimeter had to be established, guard duty shifts had to be set, refugees needed to be fed and cared for. Sunny might have as well given an order to make camp, but he was extremely reluctant to remain on the coast for an entire night. So all these things had to happen fast. Luckily, he was not the only master defending the caravan anymore. Even though most of Neve's powers seemed to have to do with water, he was still an ascended. More than that, he was an ascended from a great clan. The Nightwalker was an absolute elite among fighters, with long years of battle experience under his belt and a vast arsenal of powerful memories stored in his soul. Having someone like that by his side made Sunny feel much more confident in their chances of reaching Falcon Scott in one piece. But coming back to a vast arsenal of memories, Sunny looked at Neve with a strange expression on his face. The handsome man noticed it and raised an eyebrow in confusion. Yes, did you want something sunless? Sunny lingered for a few moments, then smiled. As a matter of fact, I do. Say, Neve, you Nightwalkers are all about naval combat, right? You wouldn't happen to have a memory or two that can help a land rat like me do well in water, would you? You know, things like breathing under it, swimming like a torpedo, and so on. Because, if you do, I am willing to trade. No, actually, I am really, really willing to trade. I all but swore to never get close to water without a memory like that, you see. Neve blinked a couple of times. Well, actually, I do have something like that, yes. What do you want to trade for? Sunny hesitated, then pointed at a young man who just happened to walk by them at that moment. See that guy? His name is Luster. He's a very valuable awakened, a top-notch talent. Do you want me to trade him to you? The Nightwalker coughed. I am pretty sure that Army Command would not be happy if you sold me one of your subordinates, Sunless. Sunny remained silent for a moment, then sighed. That's true. A pity. In the end, Sunny did make a trade with Neve. He had a surplus of memories after slaying many nightmare creatures to defend the convoy, and the Nightwalker was in dire need of weapons and armor suited for land combat, to arm his own awakened. There had been a full cohort of them aboard the battleship once, but now only 4 remained. Since these warriors of the House of Night would be defending the caravan along with the other awakened in the near future, and Saint was still slumbering, Sonny did not drive a hard bargain. That was how he received 2 new memories, which were meant to cover the gap in his arsenal when it came to traversing and fighting in the water. One of them was a simple awakened charm that allowed him to breathe underwater. It was called Essence Pearl, and had 2 enchantments. One passively produced air, the other had to be activated and gifted the wielder with the ability to see clearly, as if they were wearing a glass mask. The description of the charm simply stated that breathing was the essence of life, and beauty was its purpose. One had to be able to see clearly to appreciate beauty, and live long enough to enjoy it. How romantic! The second memory was ascended, and appeared to be an armor of sorts. In truth, it was more of a harness made out of a fisherman's net, which provided no protection whatsoever, but allowed the wearer to swim with surprising speed. The harness was called Nimble Catch, and its description told the story of a muskrat king who had sworn to eat a wondrous fish, only to learn that it could only be caught by using the eyes of the monarch of birds, his brother, as bait. The whole thing was very weird. What's a muskrat, though? Do rats eat fish? The only drawback of the strange harness was that, as usual, no other armor-type memory could be used while wearing it. Nevertheless, Sonny was happy with his acquisitions. The inability to defend himself in water had been eating at him ever since the sea journey to Antarctica, and even though he hoped to never have to use these new memories, simply possessing them was calming. Several hours after encountering the beached battleship, the caravan drove forward once again. The length of it remained the same, but there were many more people in the vehicles now. Neve had not been joking when he said that there were thousands of sailors on the mangled vessel, and even then, those were only those who had survived. Sonny honestly did not know whether to consider them soldiers or refugees, but he knew that Sergeant Jeer and the other officers would sort that out for him soon. The caravan had a lot of spare weapons, especially now that they had unloaded the surviving cargo holds of the battleship, so there was a good chance that many of the sailors would become active combatants. Even if not, Sonny was already satisfied to have another master around. Neve's presence also did wonders for the morale of everyone in the caravan, not only because he was an ascended, but also because of how flamboyantly he had appeared. If there was a sure way to win someone's adoration, it was to shower a horde of nightmare creatures trying to eat them with a barrage of artillery fire at just the right moment. Oh, maybe I should remember that method. Sonny remained on guard until the column of vehicles turned and left the coastal highway behind, climbing back into the mountains. It was only then that he allowed himself to relax and descended from the roof of the Rhino to its interior. After exchanging a few words with Professor Obel and Bate, he climbed into one of the sleeping niches and closed it to receive some privacy. There he lingered for a few moments and then summoned the runes. After thinking about it for a while, Sonny finally decided to take the risk and bind the mantle of the underworld to his soul. He did not know what would happen, and the idea of being left without a proper suit of armor was more than slightly disturbing. But, to tell the truth, Sonny was extremely curious to see what would happen. Soon he was staring at a string of shimmering runes. Bind the relic. He hesitated for a few moments, sighed, and then whispered quietly, "Yes." Sonny had dismissed the mantle, just in case, and was now wearing the soft fabric of the puppeteer's shroud. For that reason, he did not see any changes immediately. For a few seconds, nothing happened. And then the voice of the spell spoke. It said, "Your memory has been destroyed." Sonny's eyes widened. What? He flinched, almost hitting his head on the roof of the niche. His heart skipped a bit. What the hell, what do you mean? But then the voice of the spell resounded again. You have received an attribute. At the same time, Sunny felt a profound but unexplainable change. The change seemed to affect both his body and his soul. It was not painful and did not feel harmful, just very, very strange. It was as if his skin turned to stone, but also remained exactly the same. At the same time, he felt as if the enchantments of the mantle of the underworld were at his fingertips, even though the onyx armor was not summoned, and in fact had been destroyed. Ugh. Sunny remained motionless for a while, trying to understand what had happened to him. Then, unable to find answers, he turned his attention to the shimmering runes. In the list of his memories, there was no mantle of the underworld anymore. However, he now possessed a new attribute. Holding his breath, Sunny read. Attributes faded, flame of divinity, master of shadows, blood weave, bone weave. And there, a new string of runes appeared at the end. Attribute marble shell. Marble shell. Sunny stared at the runes with a thoughtful expression on his face, then concentrated on them. Immediately, new strings appeared in the air, forming a description. Attribute marble shell. Attribute description. In the deep darkness of the underworld, a prideful demon forged 7 suits of splendid armor for his favorite creations. The intricate shells were both a boon and a test, since only those worthy of his regard could unlock the mantle's true potential and bear its weight. There were more runes, but Sunny stopped to think for a bit. Favorite creations. He knew that Saint and her kind were an artificial race created by Nether, the ruler of the underworld and the demon of choice, or destiny, depending on how one decided to translate the runes. He also knew that Saint's armor bore a strong resemblance to the mantle of the underworld, although it was not quite as impressive. The original stone saint had been one of the smallest and weakest living statues that used to dwell in the Dark City. By the time Sunny reached the place of their battle against the fallen attackers, the bigger and more powerful warriors of her kind had already been destroyed, leaving only her, an awakened monster, to finish the fight. What he got from all that was that Saint had only been a foot soldier in Nether's army, most likely. The armor she wore was a true masterpiece of craftsmanship, but not something on the level of the 7 mantles, which had been gifted to the high-ranking officers of the Stone Legion by the Prince of the Underworld. Gods, if Saint is just a foot soldier, then just how terrifying was Nether's army? Well, they had to have been pretty terrifying in order to challenge the gods. The stone saint he had killed on the desolate plaza of the Dark City was a pale remnant of her original self, as well, since the living statues had not been consumed by corruption, yet during the war between the demons and the gods. Shaking his head, Sunny turned his attention back to the runes. The description of the marble shell was a bit unusual, since it included much more information than that of other attributes. He continued to read. Attribute traits: living stone, feather of truth, stalwart, underworld armament, mantle, shell, bound. The first 4 were just like the enchantments of the old mantle, with the exception of stalwart. The extremely high protection against physical attacks and the high protection against elemental attacks remained the same, but the moderate protection against mind and soul attacks had been elevated to high protection as well. Very good. The defensive trait of the shell was passive, but the other 3 traits required essence to function. From now on, Sunny would have to circulate it through his own body in certain ways, instead of pouring it into the memory to activate the effect. That was a bit weird. Luckily, he seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of how the essence had to be circulated exactly, and his control over it was intricate enough to achieve the desired result. The other 3 traits, however, were extremely interesting. The mantle and shell were connected, and in fact mutually exclusive. That was because those were not really traits, but actually forms that his new attribute could assume. The shell was a dormant form, while the mantle was an active form. As the shell, the armor existed under his skin, or rather, was his skin. Basically, it provided all the benefits of the mantle of the underworld, including access to its enchantments, albeit in a muted and somewhat weakened form. Sunny dismissed the puppeteer's shroud and stared at his arm incredulously. His skin looked pretty much the same, but somehow even paler and smoother. Great, as if I wasn't being called a creepy porcelain doll often enough already. He sighed, then jabbed his arm with a finger. There was something strange. His skin remained soft and elastic, but when sufficient pressure was applied, it suddenly became hard as stone. Basically, it was becoming rigid when struck. After a few experiments, which must have looked really weird from the side, he determined that he could control the process consciously, too. That's neat. So I will always have passive resistance to all kinds of damage. I'll be able to repair damage to my skin with the living stone as well, although that won't help me against internal injuries. He activated Feather of Truth and felt his fist becoming much, much heavier. Then he made his entire body extremely light. Ah, this feels so weird. Sunny did not exactly start to float, but he could potentially jump extremely high or hit extremely hard with the help of this new ability. The applications were nearly endless. A silly smile appeared on his face. And I can always enhance the effect of a single charm as well. Better yet, by augmenting his body with the shadows, he would be augmenting his shell too, considering that it was a part of him. That, in fact, that was the real benefit of binding the armor. Sunny's eyes widened. Wait a second. Had he not dismissed the puppeteer's shroud to take a look at his skin, which meant that he could benefit from the defensive qualities of the shell and summon an armor-type memory on top of that, using both to protect himself at the same time. Damn! That was simply incredible. Sunny was consumed by excitement for several minutes, then remembered that he currently had no powerful armor-type memories to speak of. Well, it did not matter too much. He would find one eventually. Plus, there was the mantle trait of the marble shell as well. Its function was pretty simple. It activated the attribute, making it assume the form of a full suit of armor. Unlike memories, Sunny did not have to spend essence to summon the mantle, since it was simply a transformation of the shell. Similarly, the mantle was considered to be a part of his body, and so augmenting one with the shadows would strengthen the other in turn. In its active form, the attribute awakened its full power. The effects of Stalwart, Living Stone, Underworld Armament, and the Feather of Truth were not weakened anymore, reaching their full potential. Sadly, wearing another armor-type memory on top of the mantle was out of the question. Still great. So Sunny had not really lost his armor. On the contrary, it had become stronger and could be summoned in its full glory at any moment. It's just that the mantle was now an innate part of him, as opposed to a memory. And finally, there was the bound trait. Its function was very simple. It bound the marble shell to Sunny's soul, which meant that one would grow alongside the other. Currently, the attribute was of the ascended rank, just like Sunny. If Sunny became a saint, the marble shell would become transcendent too. Laying in the sleeping niche and feeling the rhino vibrate around him, Sunny closed his eyes and let out a satisfied sigh. 6,000 kills. Ah, it was worth it. Sunny had planned to catch a couple of hours of sleep, but in the end, he was too mesmerized by the promise of the marble shell to close his eyes even for a second. That new attribute of his was both supremely powerful and complex, which meant that unlocking its full potential would demand a lot of insight and ingenuity. If he did manage to master it, though. Laying in the darkness of the sleeping niche, Sunny smiled ominously. What a great present. It should not have come as a surprise, though. The challenge of the Prince of the Underworld had been a steep one. 6,000 defeated opponents, most awakened, those normal people that did not go out of their way to seek out battle after battle, would never face that many adversaries in their entire lifetime, perhaps. More than that, Sonny suspected that the enchantment had actually had several stages, while he only completed the last one. After all, the counter of vanquished foes had already been filled to some extent by the time Sonny repaired the mantle of the underworld. An ascended armor of the 6th tier, demanding 6,000 kills to rise to the 7th. If the onyx armor had started off as a memory of the 1st tier, demanding 1,000 kills to rise to the 2nd, 2,000 to rise to the 3rd, then it might have taken no less than 21,000 defeated enemies for it to acquire the soulbound relic enchantment. What a scary number! No wonder the marble shell was such a potent attribute, not to mention its connection to one of the demons. Whether it had been the first lord of the Bright Castle or one of his companions that wore the mantle before, Sonny really owed them some gratitude, even more of it, to be precise. Regardless of the past, though, there was a lot for him to think about when it came to the future. Sonny instantly understood that the marble shell would drastically, and most importantly, passively, increase his defensive capability and resilience. Yes, the dormant state of the attribute was a weakened version of its active form, and yes, the living stone trait only allowed him to mend his skin, as opposed to his entire body. Sure, he did not currently possess a powerful memory armor to synergize with the shell. But it did not matter. In a sense, Sonny himself was the armor now. What truly enthused him about the new attribute was the possibility of finally breaking one of the most ubiquitous laws of the nightmare spell. In the world ruled by it, attack almost always trumped defense. No matter how tough an armor was, a powerful and well-placed strike from a weapon of a similar rank would most often overcome it. Otherwise, he would have never been able to kill awakened nightmare creatures as a sleeper, or continuously challenge enemies that were, strictly speaking, out of his league. Everything had its limits, of course, but generally, that was how things worked. Not anymore, though. Not with what his aspect was capable of. Someone else would have found the marble shell a powerful aid in battle, but in Sonny's hands, it could be so much more. Possibly the most important quality of the strange attribute was that it had become a part of his body, and as such, could be augmented with the shadows at the same time. An ascended armor might be vulnerable to an ascended blade, but with 4 shadows enhancing it. Maybe not. That went for elemental, mind and soul attacks as well, albeit to a slightly lesser degree. Add blood weave and bone weave to the equation, with the living stone on top of it all. Sonny might not be ready to go around slaying titans just yet, but he was halfway convinced that being hit by Goliath would not instantly kill him anymore. And that was just defense. The marble shell had the potential to do wonders for his attack potency and lethality, too. The Feather of Truth had always been an unassuming but insidiously powerful enchantment. Now that it could be applied to his entire body, as opposed to only his armor, though, that really changed everything. Making himself lighter could drastically increase his speed and mobility. Making himself heavier could help Sonny weather powerful blows, as well as increase the impact of his own strikes. Force was heavily dependent on mass, after all, and it was hard to achieve one without the other. The second part of force was acceleration, so if Sonny could learn how to skillfully weave 2 sides of the Feather of Truth together, his combat performance would take a significant leap forward. Wearing a light armor on top of the shell would be the most optimal choice in that regard, since doing so would grant him a double layer of protection while not encumbering him too much. Sonny already had some knowledge of how to use the Feather of Truth in battle, but he was going to need to adjust to its new scope, as well as relearn a lot of things, both about the trait itself and about how he approached combat in general. It would demand a lot of time, practice, insight, and most of all thinking, not to mention perfecting his ability to guide essence in just the right way. However, dismantling and mastering battle styles was something Sonny was exceedingly good at, so he had no doubt that he would see some improvements very soon. A modest improvement was not his goal, though. He wanted to reach a state where using the feather of truth to its full potential was an instinct for him, to make it something that he did not even have to think about to do. That would be a bit harder to achieve. Not impossible, though. Sonny's personal progress in terms of pure combat mastery had been stalled for a while, so now he was actually excited about a new challenge. Shifting his perception to one of the shadows to observe the dark landscape flowing past the moving rhino, he smiled wryly. Luckily, I have a whole continent of nightmare creatures to practice on. Eventually, Sonny climbed out of the sleeping niche and went about the business of managing the caravan. They had made it far into the mountains and were already moving north toward their true goal. The blizzard was still raging, reducing visibility to almost zero. The landscape was as grim and foreboding as ever. Surrounding areas needed to be scouted, maps needed to be updated, reports needed to be received, and 100 other things demanded his attention. Before getting down to it, Sonny spared a few moments to stare at the gray fabric and lusterless black leather of the puppeteer's shroud. Who could have thought that he would be reduced to seriously using it again, after all that time? It sure is much more comfortable than walking around in a full plate of steel armor. Ah, the old me had it good. Actually, not really. Sonny was ready to climb to the roof of the rhino when he noticed Bait staring at him with a strange expression. He lingered for a moment. What? She blinked a couple of times, then pulled her gaze away. No, nothing. Sonny frowned. Just say it, will you? Bait remained silent for a second, then asked hesitantly. Are you wearing makeup? This time it was his turn to stare. What? No, why would you think that? The young woman gave him a dubious look and shook her head. You just look a little different, that's all. Sonny grinned. Oh, I naturally have the complexion of a marble statue, no makeup involved. Didn't you know? Bait turned away with a sigh and mumbled under her nose. Damned awaken, how is this fair? Suppressing a chuckle, Sonny dissipated into the shadows and appeared on top of the rhino, sighing as the bone-chilling wind smashed into his chest. Surprisingly, though, he was not that cold. His passive resistance to the elements was already making itself known. Without wasting any time, Sonny made himself heavier for better stability, summoned the memory of ice, and wrapped the shadow he kept with himself around his body, simultaneously circulating essence to double the enhancement granted to the charm. A couple of seconds later, he felt even more comfortable. Sonny still sensed a slight chill, but it was in no way bothersome. Additionally, the winds were powerless against him. It was as if Sonny had turned into a small cliff. Summoning Morgan's warbow, he sat down on the roof and closed his eyes. I can get used to this. Their journey to Falcon Scott continued. Traversing the abomination-infested expanse of the Antarctic Center was still hard and dangerous, but with Neve assisting Sonny in defending the caravan, things became a little bit easier. The two masters rarely saw each other, communicating mostly over the chain of relays in the military vehicles. Sonny was stationed at the head of the column, while Neve stayed in the rear to provide the best possible defensive coverage. Mostly, they only met face-to-face during the rare stops, and when an especially dire threat demanded both of them to fight side by side to vanquish it. Going into battle with the Nightwalker was both comfortable and effective. Finally a professional. Neve was an extremely skilled warrior, using a long bone harpoon and a net woven out of unnaturally durable threads to herd and decimate nightmare creatures. It was obvious that he was not entirely comfortable fighting on land, and his aspect powers seemed to be under severe restriction, though, so the scion of the House of Night mostly supported Sunny and made it easier for him to kill their enemies, which was more than welcome. Neve was also more cautious than most masters tended to be. Not overly so, but enough for Sunny to notice the difference between the two of them. It was understandable. After all, the Nightwalker had a family to come back to. He carried more than one life on his shoulders. That perspective was a bit new to Sunny, and made him think about things that he had never considered before. Other than that, things were going as expected. The caravan continued to grow, several more groups of Erebus Field survivors joining it. By then, Sunny was secretly starting to thank the gods that Neve's ship had suffered catastrophic damage. Without the additional supplies looted from its holds, he would have to deal with a supply shortage pretty soon. As it was, though, he had enough to feed everyone and arm those who could and knew how to fight for now. Sunny was curious to see if anyone else would notice his subtle change, but in the end, the only other person other than Bait who showed any reaction was Kim. At some point, she gave him a very weird look and hastily turned away without asking anything. Kim was able to see vulnerabilities in everything she looked at after all, and Sunny had recently become much less vulnerable. No wonder she was surprised. Great, what bizarre stories are they going to come up with now? Hopefully, Belle would not be giving him weird looks again. The crow also noticed that something about Sunny had changed. The echo landed on his shoulder, stared at him with curiosity for a few moments, and then suddenly tried to peck him in the neck. After that, the bird let out a startled call. Ston, ston. Then it flew away and stayed in the air for a while. Being pecked by an awakened monster was not a pleasant experience, but the shell did not show any sign of giving in to the sharp beak. Overall, Sunny was very satisfied by the strange incident. The tumultuous march north continued. Swarms of nightmare creatures were slaughtered. More soldiers died. More refugees died too. With thousands and thousands of them cooped up in the moving vehicles, it was inevitable that some would succumb to the spell. Despite all Sunny's efforts to make sure that new aspirants were found and isolated in time, there had been a couple instances where the security measures failed. The results were bloody. Sunny was shaken by the loss of civilian lives, but in the grand scheme of things, they were just drops in the ocean. An entire metropolis had been erased off the map just a few days ago, and that was simply one instance of the inconceivable carnage and destruction reigning over the southern quadrant. Sunny was growing really tired of watching people die. He also knew that the death toll would not stop growing anytime soon. The rhino let out a disturbing, screeching sound and came to a shuddering stop. Sunny remained on the roof for a few moments, looking down with a grim expression on his face, then jumped down. Landing softly in the snow, he took a few steps away and studied his battered APC. The mighty machine had seen better days. Its armored hull was littered with deep gouges and makeshift patches of scavenged alloy. The wedge-shaped ram at the front of the rhino was deformed and painted dull red, its deployment mechanism irreparably damaged and stuck in the lowered position. The 6 mighty wheels were still intact, but all the additional thrusters were either spent or destroyed. What worried Sunny the most, though, were the sensitive internals of the APC. Despite the fact that Kim and Samara had been desperately trying to keep them from deteriorating completely, most of the systems were slowly dying. The rhino had been put through too much abuse, and now it seemed to be on the verge of failing. A sad, bitter sigh escaped from Sunny's lips. Damn it! Behind him, the rest of the caravan was in a similar condition. The column of dilapidated vehicles stretched for many kilometers, each showing some signs of battle damage and stress. Most vehicles had not suffered as much as the Rhino, which served as the vanguard machine, but then again, most of them were also not as shielded and robust as the custom APC of the irregulars. After studying the state of the caravan for a minute or two, Sonny turned around and walked forward. Passing between the massive shape of Abomination and the much smaller, but similarly fearsome shape of Blackie, he stopped and looked at the vast valley below. As he did, the crow landed on his shoulder. Sonny and the three echoes remained silent for a while. The valley was covered in snow, but it could not hide the upturned soil and the signs of a devastating battle that must have raged here once. Craters and mounds of frozen earth littered the landscape, hinting at a heavy artillery bombardment. A ghastly mountain of charred bones towered near the slopes, and some distance away from it lay a graveyard of broken war machines. Thousands upon thousands of nightmare creatures were moving through the snow. Worse than that, 13 active gates ringed the valley, tearing reality apart. What a terrible place. Sonny hesitated for a moment, then looked at Neve, who had just reached the crest of the hill. The Nightwalker was looking down with a sour face, his broken arm still resting in a makeshift sling. He had been wounded in a random battle a few days ago and was yet to fully recover. Sonny smiled. Yeah, it was even more terrible when 7 new gates opened right when we tried to deal with the 6 that had already manifested, encircling the whole division. That was how Antarctica welcomed us, all that time ago. Indeed, Sonny knew that valley well. It was where he had fought his first real battle in the southern quadrant, unleashing Saint to defend the mundane soldiers. Looking down, he could recognize the spots where he had slain the gate guardians, as well as the spot where the division had burned its dead before moving on. Was he feeling nostalgic? Well, it did not matter anyway. What did matter was that the valley was only a day's travel away from Falcon Scott. They had finally made it, almost. In the end, it took the caravan 2 weeks to get here. June was almost over, but the long night of Antarctica still showed no sign of ending. The world was dark, as always, and full of abominable horrors, as always. Nothing truly noteworthy had happened in these 2 weeks. It had just been a constant, grueling, arduous struggle to survive. Every kilometer they traversed had been a little bit harder than the previous one. The numerous skirmishes and battles they had fought all started to blend into one at some point, and the names of soldiers and civilians Sonny had lost did too. All in all, few people died, comparatively. Considering the overall size of the caravan, the number of casualties was statistically insignificant. But people were not statistics. Sonny grimaced and looked away. He might have brought most of the caravan this close to Falcon Scott in one piece, but the hardest part was still ahead of them. Due to its nature as a place of a massive and static concentration of humans, the siege capital naturally attracted numerous nightmare creatures. It was constantly besieged by hordes of abominations, with more arriving from the south every day. The caravan had to somehow break through that blockade to reach the city gates. Fortunately, they did not have to do it alone. Sonny had already contacted Army Command through the Dream Realm, reporting the date they would arrive in this valley. He was promised assistance and reinforcements, as well as a special envoy to help the refugees make it through safely. The envoy was running late, though. His shadows would have noticed anyone on the slopes of the mountains, and he did not see any humans in the valley. If someone really planned to make it to the other side and meet the caravan, Sonny had no idea how they were planning to fight their way through the sea of nightmare creatures below. Glancing at Neve, he frowned. Where the hell is that envoy? Before the Nightwalker could answer, the crow suddenly let out a nervous screech and hurriedly flew away. In the next second, a massive shadow suddenly dove down from above, approaching the caravan with stunning speed. Sonny was already drawing the string of his bow, but paused at the last moment, looking at the landing creature with wide eyes. Massive, powerful body that resembled that of a lion, mighty white wings, beautiful golden eyes of an eagle. In front of him, proud and majestic, was a very familiar Griffin. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story. And if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.